Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea, Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about Jeremiah, sometimes Ezekiel, and occasionally Hosea and others. But mainly, we talk about Isaiah, incessantly it seems.
That's okay with me. I like Isaiah. I like his style, his poetry, the simplicity of his verses, his vocabulary, his imagery. We're on a long run of Isaiah, yeah, and that's great. But this week, we at least get to spice it up with 2 verses from Samuel.
That's true, Rick, and we'll get to the reason for that and to much more. But I'm Larry Herman, today slipping some black coffee and talking Haftara with my good chaver, Rick Muller. So, Rick, what's the good news this week?
Same as it's been for the past several months. The good news is Millie, your granddaughter. Let's see.
Absolutely. That girl is a smile machine. She must be the happiest baby around.
And you must be the happiest 80. I think the 2 are related.
We are. The days that we care for Millie are the happiest days of the week, especially watching the changes almost day by day.
I see that Millie has discovered her toes.
She's discovering all kinds of things, and before too long, she'll be discovering the joys of Haftara.
Or Haftarah.
Well, you say Haftara, and I say Haftara.
And you say plethora, and I say plethora.
Haftara, Haftara.
Plethora, plethora.
Let's call the whole thing off. Hang on, Rick. Before we call the whole thing off, let's explain something to our viewers. Many people are confused about whether it's Haftara or Haftara.
But everyone knows that it's plethora.
Except when one is trying to make a rhyme, as in Haftarah Plethora, where we intentionally mispronounce both words. But the word Haftara is spelled with a tet and not with a tav, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the word Torah, even though many people think that the words are related. Haftara actually comes from the root Pei, Tet, Resh, which can mean conclude or dismiss.
And the word maftir, the noun, comes from the same root, which is the person giving the honor of the last aliyah concluding the Torah so that he or she can sing the Haftara.
The concluding or taking leave of reading from Scripture twice, the Torah reading and Haftara. And part of the confusion is that some Ashkenazim pronounce it as Haftarah or Haftarah, but however you pronounce it, it's not half of a Torah.
So should we call our Zoomcast the Haftarah Plethora?
I don't think so. I like Haftarah Plethora, and we'll leave the spelling to our chief orthographer, Norm Gar.
Or is that Narm Gore? Now that we got that straight, can we explain why we're reading from 2 different books this week?
Sure, Rick. This one is simple. The Parshat for this coming week is Re'eh, and its associated Haftara is the 3rd of the 7 haftaroth of consolation following Tisha B'Av. That explains why we read chapter 54, verse 11 through chapter 55, verse 5 of Isaiah. But the day after Shabbat...
You mean Sunday?
Right. Sunday, or rather starting Saturday night after the end of Shabbat, is Rosh Chodesh Elul. And by tradition, whenever the day after Shabbat is a Rosh Chodesh, we read the special Haftara called Machar Chodesh, which means tomorrow is Chodesh.
Which is from the book of Samuel, and it's the story of the friendship of David and Jonathan.
Exactly. And it's a rather lengthy Haftara. So most traditions only read the Haftarah from Isaiah and skip Machar Chodesh entirely. But some traditions, namely Sfardim, also read the first and last verses from Machar Chodesh Haftarah as well. And we thought that we would honor that tradition this week.
And it's in the Luach. And those two verses are very interesting for reasons that we will discuss.
But before we get to the Machar Chodesh verses, let's give a brief overview of the third Haftarah of consolation. We once again see Isaiah presenting the people with an optimistic vision of the future. In the 7 verses of chapter 54, Jerusalem will be restored to its original splendor, or perhaps even beyond that, as it is rebuilt with precious jewels rather than stone. Its children shall be disciples of Adonai, and their happiness great. The people shall be righteous and safe from harm. Enemies shall fail, whether with weapons or words, and the people shall be triumphant through God. All in all, quite a triumphalist vision.
And this text is accentuated by a plethora of exclamation words. There's a hine right at the start in verse 11. Hine anochi, it's got the kadma v'yazla that you like. Behold, I, the anochi, the intense version of ani. And then hain in verse 15, another hain read as hine in verse 16. Ahoy to start chapter 55, and then 2 more hains in verses 4 and 5.
Ahoy, I like that. The 5 verses in chapter 55 continue this good message. The metaphorical water, food, milk, and wine will be provided by God without price and without end. God is telling the people not to waste their efforts on food that is not bread and does not satisfy, clearly symbolizing worship of false gods. Rather, God will make a brit olam, an everlasting covenant, as he did with David.
Yes, David. And that's one of the things that links this Haftarah with the Haftara for Machar Chodesh. Verse 4 says, as I made David a leader of peoples, a prince, a commander of peoples, which provides a connection to the David and Jonathan story. One more thing that connects the two Haftarot, the importance of children in the narrative. In chapter 54 of Isaiah, verse 3, we read, V'chol banaich limudei Adonai, v'rav shalom banaich. And all your children shall be disciples of the Lord, and great shall be the happiness of your children.
Yes, we talked about that last week. The banayich versus bonayich, or children versus builders midrash.
Well, as you pointed out last week, in referring to Millie, our children are our builders. And Jonathan also recognized that in his concluding words to David in the Machar Chodesh reading, we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord. May the Lord be witness between you and me, between your offspring, your children, and mine forever.
A great way to connect the two Haftarahs, Rick. I suggest that we start chanting the Haftarah for Re'eh with the last 7 verses of chapter 54 of Isaiah, and then we move on to the 5 verses of chapter 55, and then conclude with the first and last verses of the Haftarah from Machar Chodesh.
That works. Most of the pyrotropics in chapter 54 are concentrated on verse 17. It's the verse that says that the weapons and words of Israel's enemies shall fail, and the Lord's servants shall triumph through Adonai. The verse has a ger shayim, 2 tavirs, a tilisha ketana, a pazer, only one. The ger shayim emphasizes the weapons, and the first tavir, the words of the enemies, both of which fail. But the pazer, the big trope, the tilisha ketana, the second tavir, are placed on this is the portion of Adonai's servants and their triumph.
Great. So the text is found starting on page 1085 of your Eitz Chaim Chumash, and it appears on the screen thanks to Norm Gar. Rick, how about the bracha to start?
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Aniya soara lo nuchama, hine anochi marbitz b'puch avanaich v'satich basapirim V'samti kad chod shimshotayich usharayich leavne ektach v'chol gvulech leavne chefetz v'chol banayich limudei Adonai v'rav shalom banayich b'tzdaka tikonani rachaki me'oshek ki lo tirai umimchita ki lo tikrav elayich ein gor yagur efes meoti migar itach alayich yipol hine anochi barati charash nofeach be'esh pecham umotzi cheli lema'asehu ve'anochi barati mashchit lechabel kol keli yutzar alayich lo yitzlach b'chol lashon takum itach lamishpat tarshi zot nachalat avdei Adonai b'tzidkatam me'iti neum Adonai.
That was great. And that last verse 17 has all the pyrotropics you talked about. So, Rick, we turn to the first 5 verses of chapter 55 now. What do you see here?
Well, trope-wise, there isn't much, but a tavir in the first verse and one more in verse 4. We do start with the exclamation hoy in verse 1, and both verses 4 and 5 begin with hein,
which Alter translates as look.
And I also like Isaiah's repeated use of the word shama, shin, mem, ayin. First in verse 2, shim'u shamoa elai, where the repetition of the word intensifies the meaning, to listen well to me. And then again in verse 3, shim'u utchi nafshechem, listen and be revived.
I'm listening. Any others?
No more shim'us, but there is a hatu. In verse 3, there's a variation, a synonym, I suppose, hatu oznechem, incline your ears, which may have influenced Shakespeare a couple thousand years later in his Mark Antony soliloquy.
I'm all ears.
And of course, we have the reference to David in verse 3, carrying over to verse 4, which I think strongly connects the two haftaroth.
Great. Rick, why don't you chant those 5 verses from chapter 55?
Hoy kol tzamei lechu lamayim basher ein lo kasef lechu shivru ve'echolu ulechu shivru velo chesef uvelo mechir yayin v'chalav Lama tishkalu chesef below lechem v'giachem below lesova shimu shamoa elai v'chlu tov v'titanag badeshen nafshechem hatu oznechem ulchu elai shimu utchi nafshechem V'echrata lachem berit olam chastei David hane'emanim hein eid le'umim netativ nagid tzaveh le'umim hein goy lo teda tikra begoy lo yeda'ucha Elecha yarutzu lema'an Adonai Elohecha v'likdosh Yisrael kifei arach.
Rick, now we make the bridge to the first and last verses of Machar Chodesh. What should we look for in your chanting?
Well, in both verses, it's Jonathan who's the narrator. In the opening verse, so this is chapter 20, verse 18, he emphasizes that David will be missed at the banquet for Rosh Chodesh. Notice that there's a Zakef Gadol over V'nifkadta. That's the core of the story to me. Saul will be looking for David. The whole thing is about their relationship. David is afraid of Saul at this point and refuses to appear. But it's the last verse that gets all the fireworks.
You mean pyrotropics?
Yes. Pyrotropics, a plethora of them. This time when Jonathan is speaking, he's way more emotional. This is indicated by the dramatic Darga Tivir underneath Vayomer, the little backward Z, and Yehonatan, the curve with the dot under it, the dot in it underneath. The drama and the trope builds to Nishbanu Shenenu. Note that the Kadma v'Azla face each other, like David and Jonathan facing each other at this dramatic moment. And then Anachnu, the diamond on top of Anachnu, the Revia, the word we, they're together, but like the Revia, their friendship is going downhill.
And then we have the end of the verse. First, Jonathan refers to Beini uveinecha, between me and you.
Also with a Revia, yes.
Referring to their relationship, which is now doomed. But this is followed by Uvein zari, uvein zaracha ad olam, between my children and your children forever, which gives hope for the future.
The builders, just like Isaiah.
Yeah. Rick, take us home.
Vayomer lo Yehonatan machar chodesh v'nifkadta ki yipaked moshavecha. And then Vayomer Yehonatan leDavid lech leshalom asher nishbanu shenenu anachnu b'shem Adonai lemor Adonai yiyeh beini uveinecha uvein zari uvein zaracha ad olam.
I love it, Rick. Just great. As always, thanks to our orthographer-in-chief, Norm Gar, for keeping our spelling consistent and correct, and for his creative selection of jazz. He stumped me the past 2 weeks. Let's see if I get it this week. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and family. We wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and a Chodesh Tov. Tuesday is your first chance to hear the shofar in anticipation of Rosh Hashanah. See you all next week.
Bye-bye.
You say either, and I say either. You say neither, and I say neither. Either, either, neither, neither. Let's call the whole thing off. You like potato, and I like patata. You like tomato, and I like tomato. Potato, patata, tomato, tomato. Oh, let's call the whole thing off. But oh, if we call the whole thing off, then we must part. And oh, if we ever part, then that might break my heart. So if you like pajamas and I like pajamas, I'll wear pajamas and give up pajamas. For we know we need each other, so we better call the calling off.